Have you ever woken up at 3 in the morning, alert, and wondered why your body feels comfortable in the dark while the world expects you to be asleep? You lie there, listening to the house settle, checking the clock, telling yourself this must be stress or age. We are taught that healthy sleep means one unbroken block of 8 hours, and anything else is a flaw to fix. If that were truly natural, then waking in the middle of the night should have always been rare, a sign something was wrong. But that didn't happen. For most of human history, people not only woke at night, they expected to. They would sleep, rise for an hour or two, tend the fire, talk, pray, then sleep again. So where does the secret lie? Is it hidden in our biology, in the night begins the mites before electric light, or in the way small groups once needed to watch and rest in turns? Tonight we will follow that question slowly, not to label you, but to see what sleep used to be. The answer is not as simple as insomnia or a bad habit. That familiar wakefulness at 3 a.m. is often called broken sleep, a modern mistake. Yet it may be something older, a rhythm your body still remembers even after the world forgot. And that is where the real story begins. For 200,000 years humans slept in 2 shifts, and we forgot how. How did we sleep? And why did we forget? It is 3 in the morning. The house is quiet in a way that feels heavier than daytime silence. The refrigerator hums low, a car passes far away, and you are awake. You did not plan this. You went to bed at 11, you followed the routine, you turned off the light, and sleep came as it usually does. Now your eyes are open, and your mind is clear, not groggy, not dreaming, just present. You reach for the clock without thinking. The blue numbers say 3-7, and a small tightness arrives in your chest. It is not fear. It is the familiar sense that you have done something wrong. You tell yourself you should be asleep, that healthy people sleep through, that tomorrow will be harder because of this gap. You check your phone, not because you want news, but because the light gives you something to do with your hands while you wait for sleep to return. The screen tells you nothing useful, only that the world is still asleep, and that makes the feeling sharper. You try the usual tricks. You breathe slower, you count, you turn the pillow, you tell your body to relax, and the body listens for a moment, then stays awake anyway. There is a strange calm in this hour, a kind of privacy that daylight does not offer, yet the calm is mixed with guilt, because every article, every doctor, every sleep tracker has taught you that sleep is supposed to be one solid block. 8 hours, uninterrupted, from night to morning, that is the picture you carry. The apps on your wrist reward you for continuity and penalize you for wakefulness. The advertisements show people sinking into bed and rising perfectly rested. The conversations at work treat a broken night as a personal failure. If you break the block, you assume you are broken. The thought is automatic now. It arrives before you can question it. You wonder if it is stress from work, or age, or caffeine too late, or the room too warm. You make a mental list of causes, because causes feel manageable, and you promise yourself you will fix them tomorrow. The minutes pass slowly. You hear your own breathing, you notice the weight of the blanket, the cool edge of the sheet, the faint ticking of a house settling. You are not in pain, you are not anxious in the usual way, you are simply awake in a time slot that your culture has labelled empty. That label is powerful. It turns a natural pause into a problem to solve. It turns a quiet hour into a failure. And because you believe the label, you fight the wakefulness instead of listening to it. You try to force sleep back, and forcing makes the body more alert, not less. This small battle happens in bedrooms everywhere, night after night, and most people never ask where the rule came from, or when it began, or who decided that night must be sealed. We treat 8 continuous hours as if it were written into our bones, as if our ancestors slept the same way in caves and tents and longhouses, as if the first humans who walked 200,000 years ago in Africa already owned alarm clocks. Yet for more than 200,000 years, humans lived without electric light, without fixed work shifts, without the idea that night must be sealed shut from dusk to dawn. They lived with long darkness, with fires that needed tending, with sounds that required listening, with small groups where someone was always half awake. The expectation of perfect continuity is not ancient, it is recent, and it sits on top of a much older pattern that did not demand uninterrupted sleep. When you lie awake at 3, You are not experiencing a modern defect. You are experiencing a moment that your biology still recognizes, even if your culture has forgotten how to name it. The guilt you feel is learned, not inherited. The quiet itself is not the enemy. If you stay with it for a while, without the phone, without the counting, you notice that the body is not distressed. It is simply in a different mode, a low-light mode that does not fit the single-block story. That mode has a history longer than any sleep hygiene checklist, a history that begins at the origin of our species, when night was not 8 hours but 12 or more, and waking in the middle was not a symptom but a space. Understanding that does not solve tonight, but it changes the question you ask while you are awake. In the old pattern, night was not one long tunnel you entered at bedtime and left at sunrise. It was a landscape with a quiet valley in the middle. People would lie down not long after dark, when the fire had burned low and the work of the day was done, and they would fall into what they simply called the first sleep. It was not deep in the way we imagine deep sleep now. It was a settling, a letting go that lasted 3 or 4 hours, enough for the body to cool, for breathing to slow, for the first dreams to pass through. Then, without alarm, without worry, they would surface. The waking was gentle, not the sudden jolt of a phone, but a natural rise as if the body had reached a shoreline. They would open their eyes to a room that was dark but familiar, the air cooler, the house holding its night sounds. They did not call this insomnia. They did not reach for a remedy. They expected the pause. For an hour, sometimes 2, they stayed in that middle space. They would sit up in bed or move to a chair near the embers. They would pull a blanket around their shoulders and listen. Some prayed, because the quiet felt suitable for thoughts that daylight crowded out. Some talked in low voices with a partner, not about problems to solve but about the day, about memories, about nothing urgent. Some were intimate, because the body was rested but not yet ready for the press of morning. Some walked to check on children, to add wood to a fire, to step outside and look at stars that were brighter without any other light. Some simply sat and watched the dark, letting the mind drift without aim. There was no name for productivity here, no list to complete. The time belonged to the night itself. After this interval, a second heaviness would arrive, a natural pull back towards sleep, and they would return to bed for the second sleep, which carried them through to dawn. This was not a special custom of one village. It was the ordinary shape of night for farmers and townspeople and travellers who lived before cheap light, and it matched a much older rhythm that did not begin with candles or clocks. For more than 200,000 years, humans lived with nights that were often 12 hours or longer, especially away from the equator, and in those long stretches of darkness the body found it easier to divide rest into 2 parts rather than force one continuous hold. The first sleep handled the initial drop in temperature and the first cycle of repair. The waking interval allowed the brain to process, to dream, to keep a quiet watch, and the second sleep brought the deeper restoration that carried into morning. That division was not taught, it was lived, because the environment made it practical. A fire needed tending, an infant needed feeding, an elder needed warmth, predators or cold required listening, and the long dark gave time for all of it without stealing from rest. The pause was therefore not empty, it was functional, and because everyone around you also woke, there was no shame attached. You did not lie alone wondering what was wrong with you. You were participating in a shared architecture of night. When morning came, people did not describe a broken night. They described 2 sleeps, and they moved into the day without the narrative of failure we carry now. The memory of this pattern is still close enough to touch in diaries and letters where people mention going back to bed or rising after first sleep, as casually as we mention lunch. It feels foreign only because our nights have been shortened by light and filled with the expectation of continuity. If you imagine that middle hour not as an interruption but as a room, the whole story of sleep changes, because you stop measuring success by stillness alone and start noticing what the body does when it is allowed a natural break. That break is not a modern invention. It is a very old habit that began at the origin of our species, when darkness lasted and community was small, and the safest way through a long night was not to pretend it did not exist, but to meet it in 2 parts. The belief that sleep must be one unbroken block did not come from the body. It came from the rooms we built around the body and the hours we began to sell. For most of human history, night was long and work stopped when light failed, so there was no reason to compress rest into a single efficient unit. The change began slowly, not with a discovery about biology, but with a change in how we lit the dark. When candles became cheap, then oil lamps, then gas, and finally electric bulbs, evening stretched forward. People could read, sew, meet, and work after sunset, and the boundary between day and night softened. At the same time, towns grew into cities, and cities needed coordinated time. Factories opened at a set hour, trains left on schedules, shops kept uniform hours, and a night that was once 12 or 14 hours of darkness became 8 hours of permission to be off. Sleep was no longer a landscape you moved through. It became a task you had to complete before the bell rang. In that new economy, continuity looked like efficiency. A worker who slept straight through was a reliable worker. A person who woke in the middle was a problem to manage. Doctors, trying to help in a world that prized productivity, began to describe any waking at night as a symptom rather than a phase, and the language shifted from first sleep and second sleep to broken sleep and insomnia. The words carried judgment, and judgment travels faster than data. By the early 20th century, advertisements for mattresses and tonics promised uninterrupted rest as the sign of health, and later, sleep laboratories designed for short studies reinforced the image of a single consolidated block because it was easier to measure in one night under bright lights. The cultural story hardened. 8 hours, straight through, eyes closed at 10, open at 6. Anything else a flaw. That story was repeated in schools, in magazines, in clinics, until it felt like nature. Yet nature had not changed. The human body that evolved over more than 200,000 years in Africa and then across varied nights still carries the older pattern of 2 temperature dips, 2 waves of melatonin, a quiet readiness to surface in the middle of a long dark. What changed was not the origin of our sleep, but the origin of our expectations. We learned to fear the very pause that our ancestors used, because the pause did not fit the new clock. We learned to reach for a phone instead of a breath, to count the minutes lost instead of noticing the calm that arrives when the house is still. The sleep tracker on a wrist turns a natural rise into a red bar, and the red bar becomes proof that something is wrong, even when the body feels fine. This is how a cultural invention becomes a biological truth in daily life, not by rewriting genes, but by rewriting the meaning we attach to a normal sensation. If you grew up hearing that waking at 3 is failure, you will fight it, and fighting will keep you awake longer, which then confirms the story. The loop is cultural, not cellular. It began when we traded long darkness for bright evenings and flexible rest for fixed shore fix, and it persists because the world around us still rewards the appearance of seamless sleep. Recognizing this does not require abandoning modern life. It only requires separating what the body remembers from what the schedule demands. The body remembers a night that was spacious, a night that began at the origin of our species when darkness lasted and community was close. And in that spaciousness, a brief waking was not a crack in the system, but part of its design. The schedule demands a single block because the day starts early and does not wait. Both are real, but only one is natural, and confusing the two is why so many people lie awake, feeling they have failed at something their ancestors never tried to do. If you open the quiet pages, people left behind before electric light, you find the night described in 2 parts so often that it stops feeling unusual. In letters written by candlelight, in household accounts, in court testimonies and prayer manuals from the centuries between the 1300s and the 1800s, men and women mention going to bed for their first sleep as casually as we mention having dinner. They do not explain the phrase, because no explanation was needed. A farmer notes that he rose after his first sleep to check the livestock. A mother writes that she nursed the baby between sleeps. A traveller records that he woke after his first sleep and lay awake listening to the wind before his second sleep took him again. The words appear in English, in French, in German, in Italian, in Spanish, with small variations that all point to the same architecture. Sleep, then a waking interval, then sleep again. In a medical text from the 1600s, a physician advises that the hours between the 2 sleeps are the best for study, because the mind is calm, and he does not present this as a cure for anything, only as a use for a time that everyone knew existed. In a legal deposition, a witness remembers an event happening after first sleep, and the court accepts the timing without question, as if saying, "After lunch, in diaries kept by ordinary people, the pattern is domestic and unremarkable. Someone writes that they went back to bed after talking with their spouse, another that they prayed during the watch, another that they simply lay still and thought. There is no anxiety in these notes, no search for a cause, no mention of failure. The night had a middle, and people inhabited it." What makes these fragments powerful is not that they are rare, but that they are common across classes and regions, in towns and on farms. In cold winters when nights stretched long and in summers when people still went to bed early for lack of light, the consistency suggests a habit rooted deeper than fashion, a habit that fits the human body living with long darkness. For more than 200,000 years, since the earliest Homo sapiens moved through African nights and later followed seasons into longer winters, humans experienced nights that could not be filled with a single uninterrupted sleep without leaving hours of wakefulness in the dark. The written record from Europe does not invent the pattern, it merely captures the tail end of it, the last centuries before cheap illumination compressed the night. When you read these sources, you notice how practical the middle waking was. It was a time to tend a fire that would otherwise die, to check a child, to relieve oneself without hurry, to be intimate without the rush of morning, to remember a dream before it faded. It was also a time for the mind to turn inward, because there were no screens, no tasks, no noise except the house itself. That inward turn is difficult to measure, but the frequency with which people mention it suggests it mattered. The language itself is telling. First sleep and second sleep are ordinal, not judgmental. They do not imply a broken first attempt. They imply a sequence, like first and second helpings at a table. The absence of apology in these texts is the clearest evidence that the pattern was normal. People did not write to defend their nights, they wrote to record them. And because they recorded them without commentary, we can hear, across centuries, the same quiet architecture that our bodies still hint at when we wake at 3 and feel oddly clear. The documents do not prove that every person everywhere slept in 2 shifts, but they show that for a wide span of time and place, the 2-part night was ordinary enough to be named, scheduled around, and remembered without fuss, which is precisely what you would expect from a behavior with roots far older than the books that mention it, roots that reach back to the origin of our species when night was long and community was the safest way through it. In prayer books and household guides, the middle of the night is given work to do, not as an emergency, but as a regular appointment. A manual for the devout suggests rising after the first sleep to say a short office, because the mind is quiet and the house is still, and the instruction is written in the same tone used for washing hands before meals. There is no suggestion that the reader is ill, only that this hour is suitable. In medical advice from the same centuries, physicians do not treat the waking as a disease to be cured, they treat it as a space to be used wisely. One recommends studying or reflecting between sleeps, another advises against heavy food during that interval, another notes that conception is more likely then because the body is rested from the first sleep and not yet burdened by the day. These are practical observations, not diagnoses, and they assume the reader will be awake. In novels and plays, characters move through the night in 2 stages without the author pausing to explain. A lover slips out after the first sleep, a servant checks the hearth between sleeps, a traveller lies awake and hears a confession that would be impossible in daylight. The narrative treats the interval as a natural stage, a time when secrets can be spoken because the world is half asleep. The tone is matter of fact, which tells you more than any theory could. People wrote about this hour because it was available, and they used it because long winter nights left them with time that could not be filled by a single stretch of unconsciousness. The consistency across genres is striking. Religious texts sanctify the hour, medical texts normalize it, fiction populates it, and none of them apologize for it. That shared acceptance points to a pattern older than the printing press, a pattern that fits a body evolved over more than 200,000 years to live with darkness that often lasted 12 hours or more. In those conditions, a single block of sleep would leave a person lying still for far longer than the body needs for continuous rest, so a natural rise in the middle solved several problems at once. It allowed the fire to be fed, the cold to be checked, the infant to be comforted, and it gave the brain a quiet window for memory and emotion without the press of tasks. The prayer books capture the spiritual use of that window, the medical texts capture the physiological calm, the stories capture the social intimacy, and together they sketch a night that was not empty but structured. When artificial light shortened the night and work schedules tightened the morning, the interval lost its purpose in daily life, and because it lost its purpose, it lost its name. Writers stopped mentioning it not because bodies changed, but because the culture no longer needed the hour. The disappearance from literature is therefore not evidence that the pattern ended in the body, only that the world stopped making room for it. If you read these sources slowly, you begin to hear a rhythm underneath the words, a rise and fall that matches what many people still feel at 3 in the morning when they wake clear-headed and strangely peaceful. The texts do not prescribe that feeling, they simply assume it, which is why they are useful. They remind us that the middle waking was once a place, not a problem, a place with its own uses and its own quiet dignity, and that the memory of that place is still stored in the way our temperature dips twice, our melatonin lingers, and our minds turn inward when the house is dark, all traits that began at the origin of our species when night was long and survival depended on both rest and watchfulness. The words for the middle of the night did not fade slowly. They fell out of use within a few generations, roughly between the 1880s and the early 1920s, the same decades when streets filled with gaslight and then electric light, when factories kept regular shifts, when schools and offices demanded a single start time. In diaries that once mentioned first sleep as casually as supper, the phrase simply stops appearing. It is not replaced by a new term, it is replaced by silence, and where silence enters, a different language grows around it. Doctors, seeing more patients who worked under artificial light and who worried about productivity, began to record waking at night as a complaint rather than a habit. The same interval that prayer books had called a suitable hour for reflection became, in clinical notes, an interruption to be corrected. Medical journals from the turn of the century describe broken sleep as a nervous condition, and the suggested remedies aim at continuity, not at understanding the pause. At the same time, popular magazines and advertisements began to sell the idea of perfect sleep as a product. Mattress makers promised uninterrupted rest, tonic makers promised to prevent midnight waking, and the imagery was always the same, a person sinking into bed at night and rising refreshed at dawn with nothing in between. The market needed a simple story, and a single block is simpler to sell than a night with a valley in the middle. As homes wired for electricity stayed bright later, bedtime shifted forward and wake time stayed fixed by work, so the natural window for a middle waking shrank. People still woke, of course, because bodies do not change as fast as bulbs, but now they woke into a culture that had no name for the hour and no use for it. Without a name, the experience became private and then pathological. A person who rose at 2 no longer thought, "This is my watch," they thought, "Something is wrong with me." They reached for a remedy, not a blanket, and the remedy often kept them awake longer, which confirmed the new story. By the 1930s, first sleep and second sleep survive mainly as curiosities in old books, not as living phrases. The forgetting was not a conspiracy, it was a practical consequence of a world that compressed darkness and standardized time. When night is only 8 hours long and morning starts at the same minute for millions, there is little room for a shared middle hour, and without shared practice, memory fades. What is lost in language is also lost in permission. If no one around you expects to wake, you will interpret your own waking as failure, and that interpretation changes the physiology of the moment, turning a calm rise into a tense vigil. The irony is that the biology underneath did not disappear in those decades. The human circadian system, shaped over more than 200,000 years in environments where nights were long and variable, still produces the conditions for a biphasic pattern when darkness is extended. Laboratory studies in the late 20th century would later show this clearly, but by then the cultural memory had already been overwritten. The disappearance of the words after 1880 is therefore a historical marker, not of a change in bodies, but of a change in the stage on which bodies act. It tells us when the modern expectation of continuous sleep was born, And it helps explain why so many people today feel guilty for a rhythm that their great-great-grandparents would have recognized without comment. The forgetting was rapid because the infrastructure that supported the old night vanished quickly. Streetlights, shift whistles, alarm clocks, and early trains. And with that infrastructure went the shared hour that once gave the middle of the night its purpose and its peace. What remains is a faint echo, a tendency to wake around 3, a quiet clarity that does not fit the single-block story, a reminder that the origin of our sleep is older than the century that taught us to be ashamed of it. In a hunter-gatherer camp, night is not an 8-hour pause between workdays. It is a long country you enter when the sun goes down, and you do not leave until the sun returns, often 12 hours, sometimes 14 in winter, a stretch of darkness that cannot be filled by a single continuous sleep without waste. The camp is small, 20 or 30 people at most, shelters arranged in a loose circle around a central fire that is never allowed to die completely. As light fades, the air cools quickly, the sky deepens, and the sounds change. Daybirds go quiet, night insects begin, distant predators call, and the fire becomes the center of attention not just for heat, but for orientation. People do not go to bed at a fixed hour because there is no clock. They go to bed when the body feels heavy and the fire is banked for the night. That first settling usually comes early, not long after dusk, because there is little else to do in the dark and because the body, after walking, carrying, digging, and sharing food, is ready for rest. The first sleep is therefore not a luxury, it is a practical response to a long night. It lasts 3 or 4 hours, long enough for the initial drop in core temperature, for the first cycles of deep sleep to do their repair, for the brain to begin sorting the day. Then, as the night reaches its middle, people surface naturally. The fire needs wood, a child stirs, an elder shifts. Someone hears a sound beyond the circle and listens. Waking is not startling, it is expected, because the environment demands a degree of watchfulness that a single uninterrupted sleep cannot provide. The middle hours are cool and quiet, the stars are bright without any competing light, and the camp is alive in a low-key way. People sit close to the embers, they speak in low voices, they share water, they check tools, they comfort each other. They remember stories that are easier to tell when the day is not pressing. This is not insomnia, it is maintenance, social and physiological, built into the structure of the night. After an hour or two, the body pulls back towards sleep, the second sleep, which carries through the coldest part of the dark toward dawn. That second sleep is often deeper in its dreaming, because the brain has already processed the first load of the day and the body is fully cooled. When light returns, people rise not from a single long dive but from a night that had a valley in the middle, a valley that served purposes no single block could serve. This pattern fits the human animal that evolved over more than 200,000 years in exactly such conditions, where nights were long, where fire was precious, where group safety depended on overlapping states of rest and alertness. The origin of our species in African savannas, and later in varied climates, meant that for most of our history, darkness was not a brief intermission, but the dominant portion of the 24-hour cycle for half the year. In that world, a biphasic night was not a cultural choice, it was an ecological fit. The camp architecture, the placement of shelters, the habit of keeping a central hearth, all support a rhythm of sleep, wake, sleep, because they make it possible to rest deeply while still maintaining a thread of awareness through the longest, coldest, most vulnerable hours. When you imagine that night, the modern idea of 8 continuous hours begins to look like a recent invention, a compression forced by artificial light and fixed schedules, not a return to nature. The body you bring to bed tonight still carries the memory of those long nights, the tendency to dip, rise, and dip again, the quiet readiness to listen in the middle dark, and that memory is not a flaw to be corrected but a heritage to be understood, a heritage that began at the very start of our lineage, when survival meant knowing how to sleep in 2 parts and still wake whole. A fire in the middle of a camp is not decoration, it is the center of the night, and a fire cannot be trusted to keep itself alive for 12 hours without help. In a world without lighters, without matches, without a switch on the wall, the embers you bank at dusk are the only seed you have for morning warmth, for cooking, for keeping animals at a respectful distance. If the fire dies in the coldest hours, you do not simply feel uncomfortable. You lose time, you lose safety, you risk having to coax flame from friction while hands are stiff and wood is damp. This is why someone must rise in the middle of the night, not in a panic, but as part of the ordinary flow of rest. That rising fits perfectly into the natural pause after the first sleep, when the body has completed its initial deep cycles, when temperature has dropped, when the mind is calm and not yet pulled toward morning tasks. The person who surfaces does not fully wake in the modern sense. They move in a low-light state, they add a piece of wood, they nudge coals together, they feel the heat on their face, they listen for a moment, then they return to their sleeping place. The whole act takes only minutes, but it preserves the heart of the camp through the longest dark. The same logic applies to shelter. A cave mouth breathes cold air all night. A lean-to made of branches and hides shifts in wind. A skin covering slips off a sleeping child. These are not failures of design. They are the nature of impermanent homes. In a long night, bodies cool unevenly. An elder feels the draft first. An infant kicks free of warmth, and the person awake in the middle hours makes the small adjustments that keep everyone within a safe range. Without that tending, the second half of the night becomes harder. Sleep fragments anyway. But with a brief, expected waking, the group maintains comfort without sacrificing rest. Sound is the third reason a single unbroken sleep was never the safest option. Beyond the ring of firelight, the night is not silent. It is full of information. Hyenas whoop and move in patterns. Lions cough and then go quiet. Wolves travel and call to each other. Even small predators rustle close to camp hoping for scraps. In environments where humans lived for most of our history, listening was as important as seeing because ears work in the dark. A camp where everyone is deeply unconscious at the same time is a camp that cannot hear the early signs of approach. A camp where sleep comes in overlapping waves, where a natural rise occurs in the middle, keeps a thin thread of awareness alive. That awareness does not require standing guard with a spear all night. It requires a state that is neither fully asleep nor fully awake, a state that arrives on its own after the first sleep, when the brain is rested enough to process sound clearly, but the body is still inclined toward rest. In that state, a person can distinguish wind from footsteps, can tell if a hyena is passing or circling, can hear a child whimper before it becomes a cry. The cost is low, the benefit is high, and over more than 200,000 years, from the earliest Homo sapiens on African savannas to later groups sheltering in Eurasian caves during long winters, this balance shaped the night. Fire needed tending, shelter needed adjusting, ears needed to stay partly open, and the simplest way for a human body to meet all three needs was not to force one long unconscious block, but to sleep, to rise briefly, to tend and listen, to sleep again. The environment selected for a rhythm that matched the length of darkness and the demands of small group living. That rhythm became normal, not because people philosophized about sleep architecture, but because nights that followed this pattern were warmer, safer, and more restorative. In modern houses with thermostats, sealed windows, and no predators beyond the walls, the original pressures are gone, but the body still carries the blueprint. It still dips after dusk, still surfaces in the middle hours, still listens, still cools, still seeks a second descent toward dawn. When you wake at 3 and feel oddly clear, you are not experiencing a malfunction of modern life. You are experiencing the echo of a world where a fire had to be kept alive, a hide had to be pulled straight, and ears had to stay open, a world that began at the origin of our species and lasted long enough to write itself into the way we sleep. In a small group, sleeping close together, safety does not come from everyone being deeply unconscious at the same time. It comes from the overlap of different depths of rest, so that at any given moment someone is more easily roused by a sound, a shift in air, a change in the fire. This is not a formal watch with a schedule and a spear. It is a softer arrangement built into the way human sleep naturally varies from person to person and from hour to hour. After the first sleep, when the body has taken its initial repair, the brain enters a lighter, more responsive state, not fully awake but no longer sealed off from the environment. In that state, a cough from beyond the fire, a snap of a twig, a child turning restlessly, can pull attention to the surface without the cost of full arousal. If one person surfaces, they tend the embers, they listen, they adjust a covering, and their quiet movement often helps others stay settled. Then, as that person drifts back into the second sleep, another body, on its own rhythm, may rise slightly, keeping the thread unbroken. Across a night that lasts 12 or 14 hours, these small risings create a continuous, low-level guardianship. Not because anyone is assigned to guard, but because the biology of biphasic sleep makes guardianship inevitable. This pattern fits what we know about the long childhood of humans, the vulnerability of infants who need feeding through the night, the sensitivity of elders to cold, the fact that for more than 200,000 years we lived in groups small enough that the loss of one member mattered deeply. A sleep architecture that allowed for a natural middle-waking, distributed risk without requiring anyone to stay awake all night, which would have been exhausting and unsustainable. It also distributed care. A mother could nurse after the first sleep when her milk was replenished by rest. An older sibling could soothe a younger one during the quiet interval. A partner could share warmth when temperatures bottomed out before dawn. These acts are not separate from sleep. They are part of the ecology of sleep in a social species. The brain itself seems tuned for this. Memory consolidation benefits from the first deep cycles. Emotional processing benefits from the dreaming richness that often deepens in the second sleep. And the middle interval provides a calm window for the mind to wander without external demand, a time when thoughts can settle without being solved. In evolutionary terms, a night that included a brief, predictable waking would have improved survival not by making individuals stronger in isolation, but by making the group more coherent through the dark. The fire stayed alive, the young stayed warm, the ears stayed partly open, and no one had to pay the full price of sleeplessness. When you compare this to the modern expectation of a single, private, uninterrupted block, you can see how far our environment has shifted away from the conditions that shaped us. We now sleep in sealed rooms, alone or in pairs, with heat that does not falter and locks that do not require listening. The external reasons for the middle waking have largely disappeared, but the internal tendency has not, because evolution works slowly, and the blueprint for a social night is still written into our temperature curves, our hormone pulses, our propensity to surface around the middle of a long dark. That surfacing is not a flaw in the system, it is the remnant of a system that once kept small bands alive through nights that were cold, long, and full of sound. Understanding it as a form of biological night watch, gentle and distributed rather than rigid and assigned, helps reframe the experience of waking at 3. You are not broken, you are briefly occupying a role that your ancestors occupied for thousands of generations, a role that began at the origin of our species when sleeping together meant surviving together, and when the safest night was not the one where everyone disappeared into unconsciousness, but the one where sleep came in 2 waves with a quiet, watchful valley in between. In the early 1990s, a small group of volunteers agreed to live for several weeks without electric light, without screens, without clocks to obey, in rooms where darkness lasted 14 hours each night, the way winter darkness would have lasted for most of human history. The researchers did not tell them how to sleep. They simply removed the modern compression of night and watched what the body chose when left alone. For the first few nights, the volunteers slept longer, as if repaying a debt, often 9 or 10 hours straight, because modern life had left them tired. Then, something shifted. After about a week, their sleep divided itself without instruction. They would fall asleep not long after dark, stay asleep for 3 to 4 hours, then wake naturally and lie quietly for an hour or 2, and then fall asleep again for another 3 to 4 hours, until morning light. No one taught them the pattern, no one suggested it. The division emerged on its own, and it emerged in every participant. During the middle waking, they were not distressed, they were calm. Their brain activity showed a state that was not quite sleep and not quite active wakefulness, a low arousal state with elevated prolactin, the same hormone associated with quiet rest and meditation. They described the time as peaceful, a kind of alert stillness. Some stared at the dark, some reflected, some simply breathed. When the lights came back on in the morning, they reported feeling rested, not broken. The experiment did not prove that everyone must sleep this way, but it showed that when you give the human body a long night, the body tends to organize rest into two distinct phases, separated by a quiet interval. That tendency is not learned from books. It is expressed when culture steps aside. It matches what historical diaries described as first sleep and second sleep, and it matches what anthropologists have observed in communities that still live with minimal artificial light. The biology underneath is straightforward. Human core temperature drops after dusk, melatonin rises, sleep pressure is high, and the first long bout of deep sleep serves repair. After 3 or 4 hours, temperature reaches a lower plateau, sleep pressure eases and the brain naturally surfaces. If darkness continues, melatonin remains elevated, light does not suppress it, and the body drifts back towards sleep without effort. In a short modern night of 7 or 8 hours, that natural rise is squeezed against the alarm, so it feels like a problem. In a long night, the same rise has room to be what it is, a bridge. This is why the laboratory findings matter for understanding our past. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of Homo sapiens, nights were often long, especially away from the equator, and there was no electric light to shorten them. The human circadian system evolved in that context, not in the context of 9-to-5 work and 8-hour sleep prescriptions. The experiment simply recreated the ecological condition that shaped us, and the body responded with the older architecture. It did not need to be taught to wake in the middle. It remembered how. The calm reported during the middle interval is particularly telling, because it mirrors the descriptions from pre-industrial sources, people praying, reflecting, being intimate, tending a fire, all activities that fit a state of quiet alertness, rather than anxious insomnia. Modern culture has labelled that state as broken sleep because we have removed the time for it to exist comfortably. When you restore the time, the state returns, not as pathology but as physiology. This does not mean everyone should live in 14 hours of darkness, but it means the tendency to wake around 3 in the morning is not a design flaw. It is a design feature that becomes visible when the night is long enough to reveal it, a feature with roots deeper than any sleep hygiene checklist, roots that reach back to the long nights our ancestors knew from the very beginning of our species. When researchers in the late 20th century took away artificial light and gave people long nights again, the old pattern returned without instruction, as if the body remembered a room it had not visited in a lifetime. In a well-known series of studies, volunteers lived for several weeks in conditions where darkness lasted 14 hours each night, with no phones, no lamps, no screens, only the natural fall of light and the quiet of a controlled room. For the first few nights they slept longer than usual, making up for the debt that modern life builds, sometimes 10 or 11 hours at a stretch. Then, after that initial catch-up, their sleep changed shape on its own. They would fall asleep not long after dark, sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake spontaneously and lie quietly for an hour or two, and then fall asleep again until morning. No one told them to do this. No cultural cue suggested it. The schedule emerged from physiology alone. During the middle waking, they were not anxious, not frustrated. They reported a calm alertness, a state that felt different from daytime wakefulness, more contemplative, more at ease. Brain recordings showed that this interval was not broken sleep in the pathological sense. It was a distinct mode, with lower stress hormones, with a mix of slow waves and quiet waking activity that resembles what older texts described as the watch. The participants described the experience as peaceful. Some said it felt like a natural meditation. Some used the time to think through problems without pressure, and then they drifted back into a second sleep that carried them to dawn. What is striking is how closely this laboratory pattern matches the historical descriptions of first sleep and second sleep, and how closely both match what anthropologists observe in small-scale societies when nights are long and light is limited. The body, freed from the compression of an 8-hour window, defaults to a biphasic rhythm, not because it is broken, but because that rhythm fits the length of darkness our species evolved with. For more than 200,000 years, humans lived without the ability to turn night into day, and in many environments, night lasted far longer than the amount of continuous sleep a body needs for restoration. In that context, a single block would leave hours of enforced stillness in the dark, which is inefficient and, in cold seasons, potentially risky. A pattern of sleep. Wake. Sleep uses the long night fully. It allows for tending fire, for listening, for social bonding, for memory consolidation in 2 stages, and it prevents the deep drop in temperature and vigilance that would come from trying to stay completely unconscious for 12 hours straight. The modern laboratory does not recreate predators or cold caves, but it recreates the key variable that disappeared with industrial light, which is duration of darkness, and when that variable returns, the old architecture reappears. This suggests that the consolidated 8-hour night is not the default setting of human biology. It is a cultural adaptation to short nights and early starts. The default, when given time, is 2 sleeps with a quiet bridge between them. That bridge is not insomnia. It is not a disorder to be medicated. It is a physiological space that the nervous system enters naturally when not pressed by alarms and artificial evening light. Understanding this changes the way we interpret a 3 a.m., waking in a modern bedroom. Instead of seeing it as a failure of sleep maintenance, we can see it as the body offering the same middle interval it would have used for thousands of generations, an interval that began at the origin of our species when long nights required both rest and watchfulness. The studies do not prove that everyone must sleep this way now. Modern life has different demands, but they do prove that the capacity for biphasic sleep is still present, intact, and ready to emerge when conditions allow, which means the guilt many people feel in the middle of the night is built on a misunderstanding of what natural sleep actually looks like when darkness is allowed to last. In the middle of a long night, the body does not stay on a flat line, it moves in waves, and those waves make a brief waking not only possible but easy. After you fall asleep, core temperature begins to fall, melatonin rises, heart rate slows, and the first deep sleep arrives quickly, doing the heavy work of physical repair. That first descent lasts 3 to 4 hours, and then the body naturally lifts a little, temperature stabilizes, sleep lightens, and the brain enters a stage where it is more responsive to sound, to touch, to internal signals. This is not a mistake in the system, it is part of the system. If darkness lasts 12 hours, as it often did for most of human history, a single continuous dive would leave the body too cold for too long, the brain too disconnected from the environment for too many hours, and the hormonal rhythm would flatten in a way that is not useful. Instead, the body creates a plateau, a gentle rise in the middle of the night, a period when melatonin remains high enough to keep you calm, but arousal thresholds are lower so you can surface without stress. In that window, cortisol is still low, so you do not feel the urgency of morning, and the prefrontal cortex, which drives planning and worry, stays quiet, which is why the thoughts you have at 3 a.m. often feel spacious rather than anxious, unless you have been taught to fear them. The brain uses this time for memory consolidation of a different kind, not the fast filing of facts that happens in early deep sleep, but the slower weaving of emotional experience, the replay of the day without the sharp edges, the kind of processing that benefits from a calm, half-awake state. This is why people who are allowed to sleep in long darkness without alarms often report a period of quiet wakefulness that feels pleasant, not broken. They lie still, they think, they may talk softly, and then they slide back into a second sleep that is rich in dreaming, because REM pressure has been building and the body is ready for it. The second sleep carries you toward dawn with a slightly higher temperature, a gradual rise in cortisol that prepares you for movement, and a brain that has had time to do 2 different kinds of work. This biphasic shape is not a cultural habit imposed on biology. It is biology expressing itself when the night is long enough to allow it. Laboratory studies that extend darkness to 14 hours show the same pattern emerging within weeks, even in modern people who have never heard of first and second sleep, which suggests the capacity is still present, only hidden by short nights and bright evenings. Over more than 200,000 years, humans lived with nights that regularly exceeded 10 hours, especially outside the tropics, and in those conditions a body that could sleep, rise gently, maintain calm vigilance, and sleep again would have advantages for warmth, safety, and social bonding. The origin of our species in environments where fire was fragile and predators were real would have favored individuals whose sleep was not an all-or-nothing switch, but a flexible rhythm with a natural valley in the middle. That valley is still there in your physiology, in the way your temperature curve has 2 troughs, in the way melatonin lingers, in the way your brain can be awake and at ease at the same time if you do not fight it. Modern life, with its 8-hour sleep window and its bright screens, compresses the night and trains you to interpret the valley as a problem. So you tense, you check the clock, you activate the very systems that keep you up. But the underlying design has not changed since the earliest humans gathered around small fires, because the design solved real problems of long darkness. When you understand that the middle waking is built into the chemistry of the night, you stop treating it as a failure of will and start treating it as a feature of the human animal, a feature that becomes quiet and useful again when you give it darkness, warmth, and permission, the same conditions that shaped it at the very beginning. If you want the old pattern to visit you again, you do not need a cave or a central fire, you need a bedroom that remembers what night used to be, which mostly means giving darkness back its length and giving the middle hours permission to exist without judgment. In a modern house, light leaks in from everywhere, a phone charger glows, a street lamp finds the edge of a curtain, a hallway LED stays on for safety, and the brain reads all of that as a thin, endless dusk. The first step is to make the room truly dark, not dramatically, just consistently. Blackout curtains that meet at the center, a small cloth over any standby light, a hallway light turned off once everyone is settled. When the room is dark for 10 or 11 hours instead of 7, the body begins to feel the spaciousness that long nights once provided, and the first sleep arrives earlier and more easily because melatonin is not competing with stray photons. The second step is temperature. In camps, the night cooled steadily, and the fire provided a small, local warmth, so the body experienced a gentle drop, followed by a stable pocket of heat. You can mimic this without hardship by letting the bedroom cool a degree or two after bedtime, using breathable bedding, keeping the core warm but the air cool, which encourages the initial deep dip that leads naturally to a middle rise. The third step is sound. The old night was not silent, it was low and alive. Wind, insects, distant animals, the soft crackle of embers. A modern room that is too quiet can feel unnatural to a nervous system shaped over more than 200,000 years to listen through the dark. A very soft, steady background, like a fan on low or a recording of gentle night ambience, gives the ears something to rest on without demanding attention. With these conditions in place, the middle waking often returns on its own, not as anxiety, but as a quiet surfacing, around 2 or 3 in the morning. The key is what you do when it comes. Do not reach immediately for the bright rectangle that tells you the time and shows you the world. Keep a small warm light ready, amber or red, low to the floor, enough to move safely but not enough to tell your brain that morning has arrived. Sit up, pull a blanket around your shoulders, breathe slowly, and let the hour be what it was for most of human history. A place between sleeps. You do not need to fill it with productivity. You can sip water, you can stretch, you can think of one thing from the day without solving it. You can listen to the house settle, you can simply be awake in the dark. After 20 to 40 minutes, sometimes longer in winter, a second heaviness arrives. A pull back toward the bed that feels different from the first descent, softer, dreamier. Follow it. Lie down. Turn toward the cool side of the pillow, and let the second sleep carry you toward dawn. This is not a technique to force. It is an invitation to allow. The body already knows the shape, because the shape was normal for the vast majority of our time as a species, when nights were long and communities slept in overlapping waves. What feels new is only the permission. When you stop treating the middle waking as a failure, the tension around it dissolves, and without tension, the waking shortens and sweetens. Over weeks, many people notice that the first sleep deepens, the middle interval becomes calm rather than restless, and the second sleep brings vivid, coherent dreams that are easier to remember. None of this requires abandoning modern life. It only requires reclaiming a small pocket of darkness and quiet that the modern world has compressed. You are not trying to become prehistoric. You are allowing a very old rhythm, born at the origin of our lineage in long African nights, and refined in caves and camps, to express itself again inside a contemporary room. The result is not just better rest, it is a different relationship with night itself, where the hours are not an obstacle to get through, but a landscape with a valley in the middle that you are finally allowed to inhabit. When the middle waking comes, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing urgent, because the state your body enters at that hour is not designed for solving, it is designed for settling. In a long night, after the first sleep has done its work of lowering temperature and consolidating the day's physical fatigue, the nervous system rises just enough to become porous. Heart rate is still slow, breathing is still deep, melatonin is still present, but the gates of attention are slightly open. This is why thoughts that appear at 2 or 3 in the morning often feel different from daytime thoughts. They are less linear, less defensive, more associative, and if you do not turn on a bright light or open a screen, they do not spiral into worry. The old pattern treated this interval as a room of its own, not a hallway to rush through. People would sit by the banked fire, pull a blanket close, sip water, speak in low voices if someone else was awake, or simply watch the dark. Nothing productive needed to happen, because the purpose was maintenance, not achievement. You can recreate that purpose in a modern bedroom by preparing a small ritual that respects the physiology of the hour. Keep a soft shawl or extra blanket within reach, so when you surface you do not get cold and trigger a full arousal. Keep a dim amber lamp on the floor, not on the nightstand, so light falls downward and does not hit your eyes directly. Keep a glass of water, not coffee, not a phone. When you wake, do not check the time with a bright display. Turn gently, sit up slowly, and let your eyes adjust to the dark. Breathe through your nose for a few cycles, feeling the cooler air enter, feeling the warmth of the blanket. If thoughts come, notice them without engaging, as if you are listening to distant wind rather than solving a problem. If you share the bed, you might whisper a word or two, but keep the interaction low and slow, matching the state you are in. After 10 or 20 minutes, sometimes longer in winter, you will feel a second heaviness, a soft pull behind the eyes, a warmth spreading through the limbs. That is the signal for the second sleep, and it is different from the first ascent. The first sleep is a fall, the second is a glide. Lie back down, turn to the cool side of the pillow, let your body find its familiar shape, and allow the glide to happen without effort. What you are practicing is not a technique to force sleep. It is a way of cooperating with a rhythm that has been present since the origin of our species. When humans slept in groups through long nights and needed a natural valley between 2 bouts of rest for warmth, safety, and quiet connection. In those nights, the middle interval was not empty. It was useful precisely because it was not filled with tasks. It gave the brain time to finish emotional processing without the interference of daylight demands. It gave the body time to stabilize temperature before the coldest hours. It gave the group time to tend the fire and listen. When you treat your own middle waking the same way, as a useful pause rather than a malfunction, the anxiety that modern culture has attached to it begins to dissolve. You stop measuring the interval, you stop fighting it, and without fight, the interval shortens naturally and becomes pleasant. Over weeks, people often notice that they remember dreams more clearly from the second sleep, that they wake in the morning feeling less rushed, that the night feels spacious instead of compressed. This is not because they have learned a new skill, it is because they have stopped suppressing an old one. The capacity for 2 sleeps with a calm bridge between them is still written into your temperature curve, your melatonin profile, your propensity to surface and settle. All it asks for is darkness that lasts long enough, a room that is cool and quiet, and a mind that does not turn on the sun in the middle of the night. When those conditions are met, the body remembers what to do, because it has been doing it for more than 200,000 years. The hardest part of reclaiming a 2-part night is not the darkness or the cool room, it is the story you tell yourself when you find yourself awake at 3 in the morning. Modern culture has trained you to interpret that moment as a failure, as broken sleep, as something to fix immediately, and that interpretation itself activates the very systems that keep you awake. When you believe something is wrong, your heart rate lifts slightly, your breathing shallows, your mind begins scanning for causes and solutions, and the quiet valley that your physiology was offering turns into a hill you must climb. The old pattern worked because people did not carry that story. They expected a middle waking, they had a name for it, they had simple things to do in it, and because it was normal, Their bodies stayed in the calm state that allows a second sleep to return easily. To invite the pattern back, you have to change the narrative first, not the mattress. When you surface, instead of thinking, "I am awake again," try thinking this is the middle, the way nights have been for most of human history. Say it quietly to yourself, not as affirmation, but as fact. Remind yourself that for more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, humans slept in long darkness and rose briefly in the middle to tend fire, to listen, to be close, and then slept again. That brief rise was not a disorder, it was part of the design. When you place your own waking inside that long lineage, the personal sting disappears. You are not alone in the dark with a problem, you are participating in something ancient and shared. The second shift is behavioral. Do not reach for the bright screen that proves the story of failure, because light at eye level tells your brain that morning has come early, suppresses melatonin, and raises alertness. Keep your movements slow, keep your light low and warm, keep your thoughts unhurried. If worry arrives, do not argue with it. Just notice it as you would notice a distant sound beyond the fire. Acknowledge it and let it pass. The middle interval is not for problem solving, it is for processing, and processing works best when you do not interfere. The third shift is temporal. Give the night enough length that the middle has room to exist without pressure. If you go to bed at 11 and must rise at 6, the window is too tight for a natural valley, and any waking feels like theft. When possible, protect a longer dark period, even if you are not asleep the whole time. Lie down earlier. Keep lights dim after sunset. Allow your body to feel the slow descent that once came with sunset in camps. Over weeks, the pattern stabilizes not because you forced it, but because you stopped fighting it. The first sleep deepens, the middle becomes calm and sometimes even pleasant, a time when thoughts are clear and unhurried, and the second sleep arrives as a gentle glide rather than a struggle. People often report that dreams from the second sleep are more vivid and easier to remember, that mornings feel less jarring, that the fear of waking in the night fades. This is not a new technique. It is a remembering. You are not learning to sleep in 2 shifts. You are allowing your body to express a capacity it has carried since the beginning, a capacity shaped by long nights, by the need to keep warmth and watchfulness alive through darkness, by the simple fact that humans evolved to rest in community, not in isolation. When you meet the middle waking with acceptance instead of alarm, you restore the conditions under which the old rhythm can function again, and the night stops feeling broken. It feels whole, with a first descent, a quiet valley, and a second descent, exactly as it was for the vast majority of our time on Earth. The 8-hour night that feels so normal today is not a timeless human truth. It is a recent invention, shaped less by biology and more by clocks, factories, and electric light. For most of our history, night was long, variable, and dark, and sleep arranged itself to fill that darkness in 2 parts with a quiet interval between. Then, beginning in the 17th and accelerating in the 19th century, cities grew brighter, work moved indoors, and time became something you sold by the hour. Street lighting made evenings safe for commerce, gas lamps and later electric bulbs extended productive hours past sunset, and employers began to value a workforce that arrived at the same time each morning, alert and ready. A consolidated sleep fit that economy better than a divided one. It was easier to schedule shifts, to run trains, to open shops, if everyone slept in one block and woke to an alarm. Medical advice followed the economy, not the other way around. Sleep manuals from the industrial era began to describe a single, uninterrupted night as healthy and mature, and to label middle waking as nervousness or indigestion. The language changed first, then the expectation, then the behavior. By the early 20th century, the idea of first sleep and second sleep had largely disappeared from common speech in Europe and North America. Not because human bodies had evolved in a few generations, but because the night itself had been shortened and illuminated. When you can turn night into day with a switch, you no longer need a long dark to rest in, and when work starts at a fixed hour, you cannot afford a leisurely interval at 3 in the morning. The body did not disappear, it adapted under pressure, compressing its natural biphasic tendency into a tighter window often at the cost of depth and continuity. People began to experience the middle rise as a problem, because there was no cultural container for it. No name, no permission, no time. Doctors, trying to help, offered tonics and later sleeping pills, which further reinforced the idea that waking in the night was pathology rather than physiology. What was lost in this transition was not just a sleep pattern, but a particular quality of night. The middle interval had once been a space for quiet reflection, for intimacy, for tending the fire, for listening to the world beyond the walls. It was a time when the mind could wander without purpose, when the nervous system could process emotion without the noise of daylight. Industrial time replaced that spaciousness with efficiency, and efficiency does not tolerate valleys. Yet the underlying biology did not vanish. Even today, when people are placed in long darkness without screens, their sleep divides again within days, as if remembering an older shape. That tells us something important. The consolidated 8-hour ideal is not the default setting of the human animal. It is a cultural accommodation to a world that values synchronized labor over synchronized biology. Understanding this history does not require you to quit your job or live without electricity. It simply reframes the experience of waking in the night. You are not failing at modern sleep. You are feeling the friction between a body shaped over more than 200,000 years of long, dark nights and a society built in the last 200 years around short, bright ones. The origin of our species occurred in environments where night demanded both rest and watchfulness, where sleep naturally came in two waves with a calm bridge between them. That bridge is still present in your physiology, even if your culture has forgotten its name. When you know the history, the middle waking stops feeling like a personal defect and starts feeling like a heritage, a quiet reminder that the night used to be longer, and that your body still remembers how to inhabit it. There is a particular quiet that only arrives in the second half of the night, after the body has completed its first deep repair and before the world begins to stir, and that quiet has shaped more than rest. It has shaped how humans remember, imagine, and feel. In a long night, the first sleep clears the physical debt, it lowers inflammation, it stabilizes energy, and it files away the straightforward facts of the day. When you surface into the middle interval, the brain is not empty. It is in a state of low arousal with melatonin still present, the prefrontal cortex still subdued, and the limbic system more accessible. This is why thoughts at that hour are less about planning and more about meaning, less about doing and more about noticing. In historical accounts, people used this time for prayer, for reflection, for quiet conversation, for intimacy, not because they were bored, but because the mental state itself invited those activities. It was a natural meditation built into the architecture of the night. Then comes the second sleep, and this is where the architecture completes itself. After the middle waking, REM pressure has built. The brain is primed for dreaming, and because the body is already warm and calm, the second sleep tends to be rich in long narrative dreams. In a consolidated 8-hour night that is cut short by an alarm, much of this late REM is lost or fragmented. In a 2-part night, it is protected. Over more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, this late dreaming would have served essential functions, weaving together emotional memories, rehearsing social scenarios, consolidating skills learned the previous day, all within the safety of a group that was still mostly asleep but never entirely unconscious. The middle interval acts as a kind of psychological palate cleanser, separating the physical restoration of the first sleep from the emotional and creative work of the second. Without it, the two processes compete for the same compressed window, and the result is often lighter sleep, more awakenings, and a sense of not having fully processed the day. When people are allowed to sleep in long darkness, as in laboratory studies, they not only revert to 2 sleeps, they report that the time between feels peaceful and that dreams from the second sleep are more vivid and coherent. This is not nostalgia, it is neurobiology. The brain evolved in conditions where night lasted longer than the body needed for simple rest, and it filled the extra time with a rhythm that allowed both deep repair and deep dreaming to have their own dedicated space. Modern life, by shortening night and flooding evenings with bright light, collapses that space, and then labels the natural tendency to surface as insomnia. But when you give the night back its length, When you treat the middle waking as a normal valley rather than a fault line, the second sleep returns, with its full complement of REM, and you wake not just rested in the body but settled in the mind. You remember dreams more often, you feel less emotionally residue from the previous day. You approach morning with a sense of continuity rather than interruption. This is the gift of the old pattern that is hardest to describe and easiest to feel once it returns. It is not about sleeping more hours total, it is about sleeping in the order your brain expects. First the deep work of the body, then a quiet pause that honors the long darkness our ancestors knew, then the dreaming work of the mind. That sequence, practiced night after night for thousands of generations, is still present in you, waiting not for a new drug or device, but for permission and darkness, the same two conditions that shaped it at the very beginning. In the quiet that follows the second sleep, just before dawn, begins to thin the darkness, the body completes a different kind of work than it did in the first part of the night, and this difference is why the old two-part pattern feels so restorative when you allow it to return. The first sleep is heavy. It is for the body, for lowering core temperature, for repairing muscle, for clearing the metabolic load of the day. The middle waking, when it is not fought, acts like a hinge, a place where temperature stabilizes, where the nervous system hovers in a calm, low arousal state, where melatonin remains high enough to keep you drowsy, but not so high that you are sealed off from the environment. Then comes the second sleep, and this is the sleep of the mind. Because you have already passed through the deepest physical repair, the brain is free to spend more time in the lighter, dreaming stages that weave memory and emotion together. In laboratory nights made long on purpose, and in historical accounts of first and second sleep, people consistently describe the second sleep as dream-rich, vivid, sometimes lucid, and they wake from it with a sense of clarity that a single compressed block rarely provides. This is not mysticism, it is timing. REM pressure builds across the night, and if you wake briefly in the middle and then return, you enter the final hours with a brain that is primed for dreaming. The dreams of the second sleep are often more narrative, more coherent, because the emotional charge of the day has already been softened by the first deep cycles and by the calm interval in between. You are not dreaming from a place of stress, you are dreaming from a place of rest. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, humans lived with nights long enough to accommodate this full arc. First the fall into deep rest, then the quiet valley for tending and listening, then the glide into dreaming sleep that carried them toward morning light. In that world, the second sleep was not a luxury, it was the natural conclusion of a night that had space. Modern life shortened the night, turned on bright light late, and taught us to fear any waking, so we compressed the arc and lost the particular quality of that final dreaming descent. When you reclaim the middle, you do not just get more sleep, you get a different kind of sleep. People who practice a longer dark period often notice that they remember dreams more easily, that those dreams help them understand feelings they could not name during the day, that they wake with solutions that seemed unavailable the evening before. This is because the brain uses the second sleep to integrate, not just to store. It takes the fragments that the first sleep filed away and it connects them. It tests associations. It rehearses social scenarios, all in the safe theatre of dreams. The calm middle interval makes this integration more effective, because you do not carry the tension of a forced continuous night into the dreaming phase. You enter it already settled. If you treat the 3 A.M. waking as a doorway rather than a wall, you walk through into a second sleep that feels like a return, not a restart. You lie down, you feel the familiar pull, and the dreams come more readily. Not chaotic, but story-like, as if your mind has been waiting for the quiet to speak. This is the gift that the old pattern preserved, a night with two distinct kinds of rest, one for the body and one for the mind, linked by a peaceful watch in between. It is not something you need to invent, it is something your physiology still knows how to do, because it was shaped over hundreds of thousands of long nights, in camps and caves, where the safest and most restorative way to reach dawn was not to sleep straight through, but to sleep, to rise briefly, to tend, to listen, and then to dream your way into morning. When you sleep alone in a sealed room with the door locked and the lights off, It is easy to forget that for most of human history, sleep was not a private performance. It was a shared vigil, and the two-part pattern made that sharing possible. In a camp, in a longhouse, in a winter dwelling, people did not all fall unconscious at the same moment and stay that way until dawn. They slept in overlapping waves. The first sleep would take the children and the weary early, then a quiet interval would rise, and in that interval someone was always lightly awake, tending the fire, listening for wind shift or distant movement, whispering to a partner, checking a breathing child. Then the second sleep would come, and different people would surface at different times, so that across a night of 10 or 12 hours of darkness there was never a moment when everyone was fully gone. This was not planned by a schedule. It was produced naturally by the biphasic rhythm that emerges when nights are long. The middle waking created a built-in watch, a soft rotation of attention that kept the group safe without requiring anyone to stay up all night. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species in small interdependent bands, this overlapping pattern would have been a quiet advantage, reducing risk from predators, from cold, from fire going out, while still allowing everyone to get both deep repair and dreaming rest. The modern ideal of 8 hours of solitary, uninterrupted sleep is efficient for factories and apartments, but it isolates us in a way our nervous systems were not shaped for. When you wake at 3 in the morning now, the cultural story tells you that you are broken and alone. So you reach for a phone that connects you to the whole world, but not to the person breathing next to you. In the old pattern, that same waking would have been a moment of connection, a brief overlap where you might hear another person stir, exchange a low word, feel the warmth of shared blankets, and know without speaking that you are not alone in the dark. Reclaiming the two-part night is therefore not only about biology, it is about restoring a social texture to darkness. You do not need a tribe to begin, you only need to change what the middle interval means inside your own home. If you share a bed, treat the middle waking as a time for quiet closeness rather than frustration. A hand on a back, a synchronized breath, no bright light, no problem solving. If you live alone, treat it as a time to feel lineage rather than loneliness. To remember that countless generations before you lay awake in the same valley of night, listening to the same kind of silence. The calm that people report in laboratory long nights is not just chemical, it is ancestral. It is the body relaxing into a state that evolved to be safe because others were nearby, even if only in memory. When you stop fighting the middle and allow it, your nervous system downshifts, heart rate steadies, and the sense of isolation softens, because you are no longer interpreting the waking as a personal failure but as a participation in an old communal rhythm. You do not have to recreate a prehistoric camp. You only have to give the night enough darkness and enough permission for the old overlap to express itself, even in a small way. Over time, partners often find that their middle wakings begin to align, not perfectly, but enough to create brief, tender intersections in the dark, the very intersections that once kept fires alive and children warm. That alignment is not coincidence. It is the same physiology that shaped us from the beginning, reminding us that sleep was never meant to be a solitary shutdown, but a shared tide with 2 high waters and a quiet shore between them. In the middle of a long night, when the first sleep has already softened the body and the second sleep has not yet arrived, conversation changes its shape. It becomes slower, lower, and more honest, because the parts of the brain that guard and perform are still half asleep. Historical diaries and oral accounts from times when 2 sleeps were normal describe this interval, not as empty time, but as the hour, for quiet talk, for confidences, for intimacy that daylight did not allow. People would sit up in bed, pull a blanket around their shoulders, speak in voices barely above a whisper, and say things they would not say at the table. There was no rush to finish, no task waiting, no audience, only the dark and the knowledge that the world was still. This was not a cultural decoration added to biology. It was a natural consequence of the physiology of the middle waking. Melatonin is still present, keeping the body calm. Cortisol is still low, so anxiety is muted. The prefrontal cortex, which judges and plans, is less dominant, while emotional and associative networks are more accessible. In that state, you do not rehearse arguments. You remember feelings, you do not solve problems, you share them. For more than 200,000 years, Since the earliest humans slept in close groups through long nights, this soft window would have served as a social glue, a time when bonds were repaired without the pressure of daylight roles. Parents could soothe a child, partners could reconnect after a hard day, elders could pass a story, all without leaving the warmth of the sleeping place. The modern pattern of consolidated sleep, compressed into a tight 8-hour block and often experienced alone or in silence, has largely erased this hour of low-light communion. When people wake now at 2 or 3, they are taught to stay still, to not disturb, to stare at the ceiling and will themselves back to sleep, which turns a naturally social interval into a solitary struggle. If you instead allow the old meaning to return, the middle waking stops feeling like insomnia and starts feeling like an invitation. You do not need to turn on a lamp or start a deep discussion. You only need to permit a small warm exchange if another person is awake, a touch, a few words, a shared breath. The key is to keep everything dim and slow, so you do not tell the brain that morning has come. Keep light amber and low, keep voices soft, keep the interaction brief and tender, and then let the second sleep draw you both back down. Even when you're alone, the same physiology makes the middle a good time for a different kind of inner conversation. Not the worried planning that daylight encourages, but a gentle review of the day without judgment, a noticing of what mattered. This is why many people in long darkness studies describe the interval as peaceful and contemplative, not anxious. Their bodies are experiencing the state that once made the night a time for connection rather than isolation. You are not inventing a new wellness practice. You are allowing a very old social rhythm to express itself again, a rhythm shaped at the origin of our species, when survival depended not only on individual rest, but on the quiet coordination of a group through darkness. When the middle is treated as a place to meet, even briefly, the fear of waking dissolves, because the waking has a purpose that feels human. Over weeks, this changes the texture of the whole night. The first sleep deepens because you are not bracing against a possible waking. The middle becomes a soft bridge rather than a gap, and the second sleep arrives with a sense of continuity, often carrying you into dreams that feel more relational, more vivid, as if the brain is using the extra space to practice connection. That is the inheritance hidden inside the old 2-part night, not just better rest, but a reminder that darkness was once a time when we turned toward each other, not away. If you give the night back its full length and allow the middle to exist without alarm, something subtle begins to happen, not only inside your body, but between you and the people you share darkness with, even if that sharing is only through memory. The 2-part pattern was never just about individual restoration, it was about synchronization, about creating a gentle overlap so that a group could move through long darkness without ever being completely vulnerable. In a modern home, you can feel a version of this when you stop treating a 3 a.m. waking as a private failure and start treating it as a shared human rhythm. Partners who both learn to expect the middle often find that their wakings begin to drift toward each other, not because they force it, but because their temperature curves and melatonin profiles are responding to the same dark, cool room. When that overlap occurs, even for 10 quiet minutes, the night feels less solitary. You do not need to talk. You only need to breathe together in the low light, to feel the warmth under the same blanket, to know that the valley between sleeps is a place you inhabit together. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species in small bands that depended on each other for warmth and safety, this soft coordination would have been ordinary, a nightly reminder that survival was collective. The modern ideal of perfectly consolidated, perfectly silent sleep has made us efficient but also more alone in the dark, and that aloneness amplifies the anxiety that turns a natural waking into insomnia. When you restore the old shape, even partially, the anxiety loosens because the nervous system receives a different message. You are not broken, you are participating in something ancient and shared. Families can use the middle in simple ways that do not disrupt rest. A parent checking a child without turning on white light, a quiet adjustment of blankets, a brief hand on a forehead, all done in the amber glow that does not reset the brain to morning. These small acts echo the original function of the interval, keeping watch without keeping everyone awake. If you live alone, the synchronization can be with lineage rather than a present person, a felt sense that countless others have lain awake in this same soft hour, listening to the house settle, feeling the same calm. That sense is not imagination, it is physiology remembering its context. The brain in the middle waking is wired for low-threat social processing, which is why thoughts at that hour are less defensive and more reflective, why memories surface without urgency, why you can hold a feeling without needing to fix it immediately. When you honor that state, you stop importing daylight habits into the night. You stop reaching for the bright screen that simulates day and isolates you further. Instead, you keep the room dark, you keep movements slow, you allow the second sleep to arrive as a natural descent rather than a forced shutdown. Over weeks, the whole household often begins to sleep more deeply, not because everyone sleeps straight through, but because no one fears the middle anymore. The first sleep becomes more solid, the middle becomes a brief, peaceful bridge, and the second sleep brings the long, narrative dreams that integrate the day. This is the quiet restoration that the industrial night took from us, not just hours of rest, but the feeling that night is a communal landscape with a valley in the center where we can meet, even silently. You do not need to return to a cave to experience it. You only need darkness that lasts, warmth that is shared, and permission to let the old rhythm express itself. When those conditions are present, the body remembers what it has always known since the beginning, that the safest way through a long night was never to disappear alone for 8 hours, but to sleep, to rise softly, to tend and to listen, and then to sleep again, together. One of the quietest ways a culture reshapes a body is by renaming a normal experience as a disorder, and this is exactly what happened to the middle waking when modern medicine met the industrial night. In sleep clinics today, waking for 20 or 30 minutes around 2 or 3 in the morning is often charted as sleep maintenance insomnia, a problem to be fixed with hygiene rules, cognitive techniques, or medication, not because the physiology is new, but because the expectation has changed. The diagnostic manuals were written in an era of electric light and fixed work hours, when a consolidated 8-hour block became both economically useful and morally praised. Anything that deviated from that block began to look like pathology. Yet when researchers take healthy adults and place them in long darkness without screens, the same middle waking reappears within days, not as distress but as a calm, predictable rise. People do not toss and turn. They sit up, they think quietly, they feel drowsy but alert, and then they glide back into a second sleep that is rich with dreams. This tells us that the waking itself is not the illness, the story we tell about it is. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, humans moved through nights that were longer than their need for continuous unconsciousness, and the body learned to divide rest into 2 phases with a gentle bridge between them. That bridge allowed temperature to stabilize, allowed the brain to shift from deep physical repair to emotional integration, and allowed a group to maintain a soft watch through darkness. When you call that bridge insomnia, you activate the very systems that keep you awake. Worry raises heart rate, checking the clock raises light exposure, trying hard to force sleep raises arousal, and the natural valley turns into a struggle. The medicalization also obscures the difference between a brief, peaceful surfacing and a true disorder. A true disorder often involves chronic hyperarousal, pain, breathing disruption, or anxiety that persists all night, not a predictable, calm interval that resolves into a second sleep when darkness is long enough. By lumping the old biphasic pattern in with pathology, modern advice inadvertently trains people to fight their own biology. The prescription of sleeping pills for middle waking is a clear example. The drugs may suppress the waking, but they also suppress the architecture that the waking protects, particularly the late REM-rich second sleep that is important for memory and mood. What is lost is not just a few minutes of wakefulness, it is the quality of the rest that follows. Understanding the history does not mean rejecting medical help when it is truly needed. It means asking a better first question. Is this waking distressing because my body is broken, or because my night is too short and too bright and my culture has no name for the valley? When you restore darkness, when you keep light low and warm, when you stop checking the time, many people find that the middle softens on its own, it shortens, it becomes pleasant, and the second sleep returns without effort. That outcome is not a treatment success, it is a remembering. You are not curing insomnia, You are removing the conditions that made a normal rhythm look like a disease. The shift in language matters more than it seems, because language shapes expectation, and expectation shapes physiology. If you expect a seamless 8 hours and you surface at 3, your brain interprets mismatch as threat. If you expect a 2-part night with a quiet middle, your brain interprets the same surfacing as normal, and normal does not trigger fight or flight. This is why reclaiming the old pattern begins not with a new mattress but with a new story, one that places your experience inside a much longer human timeline, where waking in the dark was not a symptom to suppress but a space to inhabit briefly before dreaming again. When the second sleep is allowed to complete itself without an alarm cutting through its final dreaming phase, the morning that follows feels different, not because you slept longer in total hours, but because you slept in the order your brain expects, and that order changes how you carry the day. People who reclaim a 2-part night often report that they wake not with the jolt of adrenaline that a single compressed block requires, but with a slow surfacing, as if rising from deep water, eyes opening to dim light, body warm, thoughts already loosely organized by the dreams that just finished. This is the natural consequence of protecting the late REM that the second sleep specializes in. In a consolidated 8-hour night that is shortened by late screens and early alarms, much of that late REM is truncated, and you begin the day with emotional processing unfinished, which is why mornings can feel edgy or foggy even after what looks like enough sleep. When you sleep in 2 phases with a calm middle, the first sleep handles the heavy physical repair, the middle provides the quiet reset, and the second sleep gives the brain uninterrupted time to weave memory, regulate mood, and rehearse social scenarios. You wake with that weaving already done, so the day starts with a sense of continuity rather than a sense of catching up. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, humans would have experienced this kind of morning routinely, because nights were long and dark and the second sleep could run its full course toward dawn. There was no sudden artificial light, no phone demanding attention, only a gradual brightening that matched the gradual lightening of sleep. The modern habit of forcing a single block and then shocking the system awake is efficient for schedules, but it works against the physiology that evolved in those long nights. If you want to feel the difference, you do not need to quit your job. You only need to protect the edges of the night. Go to bed earlier by dimming lights after sunset. Keep the bedroom truly dark so the first sleep starts sooner. Allow the middle waking to be a calm valley rather than a problem, and then guard the final hour of the second sleep from bright screens and alarms set too early. Even a small shift, 30 to 60 minutes of extra darkness in the evening and a gentler wake time, can restore enough of the second sleep for its effects to be noticeable. People describe it as waking with a clearer emotional tone, less reactivity, easier access to words and ideas, because the dreaming brain has already done some of the integration work overnight. The body also benefits, because the temperature curve that supports 2 sleeps ends with a natural rise toward morning, and when you align your waking with that rise instead of fighting it, cortisol releases in a smooth wave rather than a spike. Over weeks, this changes not only how you feel at 7 a.m., but how you use the whole day. You become less dependent on caffeine to force alertness, because alertness is already present from completed sleep cycles. You become less prone to the mid-afternoon crash, because the deep work of the first sleep and the integrative work of the second sleep have both been respected. You begin to trust the night again, which reduces the performance anxiety that keeps many people awake. The 2-part pattern does not ask you to live in the past. It asks you to let a very old sequence finish itself in the present. When that sequence is honored, morning stops being a battle to start and becomes a continuation of a process that began the evening before, a process shaped over hundreds of thousands of nights when humans slept, woke briefly to tend and listen, then slept again and dreamed their way into dawn. That is the gift hidden in the second sleep, not just more rest, but a better quality of waking, one that feels earned by the night rather than stolen from it. When you stop measuring a night by whether it was unbroken and start measuring it by whether it felt whole, the whole relationship with sleep changes. Because wholeness is not the absence of waking, it is the presence of the right sequence. A whole night, in the old pattern, has 3 movements, not 1. The first movement is the deep fall, the body letting go, temperature dropping, slow waves washing through the brain, repairing tissue and clearing metabolic load. The second movement is the quiet valley, the middle waking that is not a mistake but a hinge, a time when you are drowsy yet aware, when the nervous system is calm enough to listen but not so aroused that you are driven to act. The third movement is the second sleep, lighter, dream-rich, carrying you toward dawn with long stretches of REM that integrate emotion and memory. For more than 200,000 years since the origin of our species, humans lived this three-part arc night after night, because darkness lasted longer than a single block of unconsciousness required. Industrial life shortened the night and taught us to fear the valley, so we compressed the arc and then wondered why mornings felt thin and nights felt fragile. Reclaiming the pattern does not require a new device. It requires restoring the conditions that let the arc complete itself. Keep evenings dim so the first sleep starts early enough. Keep the middle dark and warm so the valley stays calm. And protect the final hour so the second sleep is not cut by an alarm. When those three conditions are met, even in a modern apartment, the body remembers the sequence. The first sleep deepens because you are not bracing against a possible waking. The middle shortens and softens because you are not interpreting it as failure, and the second sleep lengthens because you have given it time to finish its dreaming work. People often notice the change first, not in how long they sleep, but in how they feel about waking at 3. The panic is gone, replaced by a quiet recognition. This is the middle. This is normal. That single shift in interpretation lowers arousal, which is the very thing that allows the second sleep to return easily. Over weeks, the benefits accumulate in ways that are hard to fake with supplements or hacks. Mornings become less jarring, dreams become easier to recall, daytime irritability softens because emotional processing was completed overnight, and the fear of the night itself fades. This is not a return to the past for nostalgia. It is a practical realignment with a physiology that has not changed since the beginning. Your brain still expects a long dark. Your temperature curve still dips twice. Your REM pressure still builds toward dawn. When you honor that expectation, sleep stops being a performance you must perfect and becomes a landscape you move through, with a first descent, a quiet plain, and a second ascent toward light. The industrial idea of 8 unbroken hours was useful for factories, but it is not the only way to be rested, and for many bodies it is not the most restorative way. The older way, the 2-part night with its calm middle, offers something modern sleep often lacks: permission to be briefly awake without alarm, and therefore permission to sleep deeply afterward. If you give yourself that permission, consistently, the night stops feeling broken. It feels complete, exactly as it was designed to feel during the vast majority of human history, not as a single plunge, but as a journey with a valley in the middle where you can breathe, listen, and then dream your way home to morning. If you watch a newborn sleep without trying to shape it, you will see the old pattern in its purest form, not because the baby has learned it, but because the baby has not yet unlearned it. Infants do not sleep in one long consolidated block. They sleep in short cycles. They surface, they feed, they settle, they sleep again, and across a long night this creates a natural rhythm of 2 or more distinct sleep periods, with quiet wakefulness in between. Parents today are taught to see this as a problem, to be trained away as quickly as possible, to aim for sleeping through the night by 3 months, 6 months, a year, as if continuity were maturity. Yet what looks like fragmented sleep in a modern nursery is remarkably similar to the biphasic pattern that adults revert to when nights are long and dark. The baby wakes, not in distress alone, but because its small body needs warmth, food, and contact, and because its brain is built to surface regularly in darkness. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, human infants would have slept pressed against a caregiver in environments where nights were long, cool, and potentially unsafe. Waking briefly to check proximity, to nurse, to be soothed, was not a flaw. It was a survival feature that kept the infant connected and the group lightly vigilant. The 2-part adult pattern is essentially a stretched-out, mature version of this same rhythm. A first deep sleep, a calm interval of partial arousal, and a second sleep rich in dreaming. When we force infants into solitary cribs in separate rooms and then label their natural surfacing as sleep regression, we are imposing an industrial expectation of consolidated sleep onto a biology that evolved for something else. This does not mean parents must accept exhaustion. It means the goal can shift from eliminating all wakings to making the wakings calm and brief, preserving the darkness, the warmth, and the low stimulation that allow both parent and child to return easily to the second sleep. Keep lights amber and dim, keep voices low, avoid screens and bright overheads during night feeds. Treat the waking as a quiet bridge rather than a morning. When the environment supports it, many families find that the infant's night naturally organizes into 2 longer sleep periods with a predictable middle interval, exactly the shape that historical accounts describe for adults in pre-industrial times. The parallel is not coincidence, it is continuity. The infant brain is not broken, it is expressing the default human pattern before culture trains it away. As children grow, the cycles lengthen and consolidate, but the underlying tendency to surface in the middle of a long night remains, which is why toddlers and young children so often wake around 2 or 3, call out, seek reassurance, and then fall back into a deep second sleep until dawn. If that reassurance is given in a calm, dark way, the child learns that the middle is safe, not frightening, and the second sleep becomes robust. If instead the child is left to cry it out under bright monitors or is stimulated with play and screens, the nervous system learns to associate night waking with high arousal, and the natural biphasic rhythm becomes tangled with anxiety. Understanding the deep history helps parents reframe those wakings, not as failures of training, but as echoes of a much older design where nights were long and connection during the valley kept everyone safer and more rested. You do not need to recreate a prehistoric camp. You only need to protect darkness, proximity, and calm during the middle, the same 3 conditions that allowed our ancestors to move through long nights with infants without losing the restorative power of the second sleep. When those conditions are present, both parent and child often find that the night feels less broken, not because no one wakes, but because waking has a place, a purpose, and a gentle return. As children grow out of infancy, the pressure to consolidate their sleep into a single unbroken block becomes cultural rather than biological, and much of the bedtime struggle that families experience comes from this mismatch. Toddlers naturally retain a tendency to surface in the middle of a long night, especially in winter when darkness lasts 10 or more hours, and their bodies are still wired for the old biphasic shape. A first deep sleep that handles growth and physical repair, a brief interval of lighter arousal, and then a second sleep that is rich in dreaming and emotional processing. Modern parenting advice often interprets that middle surfacing as a sleep problem, a regression, a habit to break, and responds with sleep training methods that aim to eliminate the waking at all costs, sometimes by leaving the child alone to self-soothe in the dark. While those methods can produce longer stretches of silence, they often do so by raising stress arousal, which teaches the nervous system to suppress the natural valley rather than to move through it calmly. For more than 200,000 years since the origin of our species, human children would have slept in close contact with caregivers through long nights, waking briefly to check proximity, to be warmed, to hear a familiar breath, and then sinking back into the second sleep without ever fully activating a stress response. That brief contact was not spoiling, it was the mechanism that kept the biphasic rhythm intact and safe. When we recreate even a small version of that contact today, keeping the room dark, using a very low amber light only if needed, responding with a quiet voice and touch rather than stimulation, children often learn that the middle is not frightening, it is simply a pause. Over weeks, the pause shortens on its own, not because the child has been trained to stay unconscious, but because the child no longer associates waking with alarm. The second sleep that follows is then deeper and more continuous, and parents notice that mornings are easier, not because the child slept straight through, but because the child completed both phases of the night without distress. The same principle applies to older children who wake around 3 a.m. with worries or vivid dreams. In a consolidated sleep model, that waking is treated as insomnia, and the child is encouraged to fight it, to stay in bed, to force sleep. In a biphasic model, that waking is treated as the natural valley, a good time for a brief, calm reassurance. A sip of water, a few slow breaths together in the dark, and then a gentle return to the second sleep where the brain can finish its emotional work. This approach does not create dependency, it creates security, and security is what allows the nervous system to downshift. The irony is that by accepting a brief middle waking as normal, families often end up with more total rest, because they stop spending hours in battles at bedtime trying to prevent a waking that biology expects. You do not need to abandon routines, you only need to adjust the story you tell about the night. Instead of aiming for one perfect block, aim for a whole night with 3 parts: a first sleep for the body, a quiet middle for connection, and a second sleep for the mind. When children experience that shape repeatedly, their bodies learn it, and as they move into adolescence, when sleep pressure naturally shifts later, they carry with them a template for moving through long winter nights without fear. That template is not new. It is ancient, shaped over hundreds of thousands of nights when children slept close, woke briefly, were soothed in darkness, and then dreamed their way to dawn, not alone, but as part of a rhythm shared by the whole group. As children grow out of infancy, and into the years where culture begins to demand early school starts and late homework, the natural tendency to surface in the middle of a long night does not disappear, it simply changes its shape, and how adults respond to that shape determines whether a child learns to fear the dark or to trust it. A 5-year-old who wakes at 3 and pads quietly to a parent's bed is not regressing. A 10-year-old who lies awake for 20 minutes after a vivid dream is not developing insomnia. A teenager who cannot fall asleep before 11 and then wakes briefly around 2 is not broken. They are all expressing variations of the same biphasic architecture that emerges whenever nights are long enough and pressure to perform sleep is low enough. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, children would have moved through nights in close proximity to others, with darkness lasting 10 or more hours in winter, and their sleep would have naturally organized into a first deep period, a calm interval, and a second dream-rich period toward dawn. In that world, a middle waking was met with warmth, a low voice, a hand on the back, not with bright lights, screens, or anxiety about tomorrow's schedule. The modern response often does the opposite. We turn on the overhead, we check the clock, we ask worried questions, we offer a tablet to distract, and in doing so we teach the child's nervous system that waking equals high arousal. Over time, the child begins to anticipate the waking with tension, which is precisely what turns a normal valley into a struggle. If instead we protect the conditions that allow the old pattern to express itself calmly, children learn a different lesson: that nights have a middle, that the middle is safe, and that returning to sleep is easy when the environment stays dark and quiet. This means keeping bedtime early enough to allow a long dark window, not as punishment, but as biology. It means using amber nightlights instead of white LEDs. It means responding to a night waking with minimal stimulation, a brief reassurance, no long conversations, no screens, and then a gentle return to bed. For adolescents, whose circadian rhythms naturally shift later, the principle is the same, but the timing moves. They need a protected late evening without bright study lights, and a morning that does not start before their second sleep has finished its work. When schools force a 6:30 wake time, they are cutting the second sleep short, which is why so many teens feel foggy and irritable, not because they are lazy, but because the dream-rich final phase that integrates emotion has been truncated night after night. Understanding the deep history gives parents and teachers a different frame. Not how do we force this child to sleep through, but how do we give this child enough darkness for the natural 2-part rhythm to complete itself? The answer is rarely a supplement or a strict training program. It is usually simpler and older, an earlier dimming of the house, a cooler bedroom, a consistent calm response to middle wakings, and a respect for the fact that the human brain was shaped over hundreds of thousands of long nights to sleep, to surface briefly, and to sleep again. When children experience that sequence repeatedly without fear, they carry into adulthood a felt sense that the night is not an obstacle to survive, but a landscape to move through. With a first descent, a quiet plain, and a second rise toward morning. That felt sense is the real inheritance, more valuable than any sleep training chart, because it preserves the architecture that allows both deep physical restoration and the emotional integration that only the second sleep provides. You are not indulging a child by honoring the middle. You are allowing an ancient pattern to do the work it evolved to do, and in doing so you give them nights that feel whole, not broken, exactly as nights felt for the vast majority of human childhood before the invention of short, bright, solitary sleep. As people grow older, something curious happens that sleep clinics often label as early morning awakening or fragmented sleep, but that looks remarkably like a return to the old pattern rather than a breakdown of the new one. After 60 or 70 years of trying to force a single consolidated block, many elders find themselves sleepy soon after dusk. They fall into a deep first sleep around 9 or 10, they surface naturally between 1 and 3, they lie quietly, they read by dim light or simply rest, and then they drift into a second sleep that carries them toward dawn. Doctors frequently treat this as insomnia to be medicated, yet when you remove the pressure to stay unconscious for 8 straight hours, the experience is often peaceful, not distressing. The body is not failing to sleep, it is reverting to a biphasic rhythm that fits an aging physiology. With age, the circadian drive for long continuous sleep weakens slightly, melatonin onset comes earlier, the homeostatic pressure builds faster in the evening, and the need for deep, slow-wave sleep in the first part of the night remains strong while the ability to sustain it all night diminishes. The result is a natural division, a solid first sleep for physical restoration, a calm middle interval, and a lighter second sleep rich in dreaming. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, elders would have been the keepers of the middle watch in long winter nights, not because they were assigned a shift, but because their bodies naturally surfaced when younger adults were deepest asleep. That surfacing served the group. Someone was awake enough to tend the fire, to listen for danger, to comfort a child, without anyone having to stay up all night. In modern homes, where nights are short and bright and everyone is expected to sleep the same way, this natural re-emergence of the two-part pattern is pathologized, and elders are told they have a disorder. The cost is not just a prescription, it is the loss of a meaningful role in the night. When the middle waking is accepted rather than fought, many older adults report that their days improve, not because they sleep more hours, but because they sleep in the order their aging brain prefers. The first sleep gives them the deep rest that supports immune function and tissue repair. The middle provides a quiet time for reflection that daylight rarely allows, and the second sleep gives them the REM they need for mood regulation and memory integration. If you honor this rhythm, the practical steps are simple and gentle. Go to bed when sleepy in the early evening, rather than forcing wakefulness with television. Keep the middle dark and warm with only amber light if you need to rise. Avoid checking the clock or the phone which signals morning to the brain, and allow a second sleep to unfold without guilt about waking early. Napping can also fit naturally. A brief early afternoon rest mirrors the same biphasic tendency and does not ruin the night when the night itself is already in 2 parts. The key is to stop measuring success by uninterrupted hours and start measuring it by how restored you feel across the whole 24-hour cycle. When elders are given permission to live this older rhythm, the anxiety around sleep often fades, and with it the need for sedatives that blunt both deep sleep and dreaming. What remains is a pattern that feels familiar not because it is new, but because it is ancient. A first sleep for the body, a quiet watch in the middle, and a second sleep for the mind, a sequence that served human communities through long nights for hundreds of thousands of years, and that the aging body still remembers how to do when the lights are low and the night is long enough to hold it. When an older adult stops fighting the middle waking and begins to use it instead of fearing it, the whole texture of the night softens, because the nervous system is no longer being asked to do something it is less able to do with age, which is to stay deeply unconscious for 8 continuous hours under artificial conditions. The aging brain still produces slow-wave sleep, but it produces it earlier and in a more concentrated burst during the first part of the night. Then it naturally lightens, which is why the first sleep often feels so solid and satisfying, and why the waking that follows is not groggy but clear. If you treat that clarity as a problem, you turn on bright lights, you check your phone, you start worrying about not sleeping, and you push cortisol up, which makes returning to the second sleep difficult. If you treat that clarity as the old middle watch, you keep lights dim and amber, You stay warm, you might sip water, stretch gently, or simply lie and listen to the house, and the body stays in a state that allows the second sleep to arrive on its own. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, elders who surfaced in the middle of long nights were not considered insomniacs. They were considered useful. They could tend a low fire, check on children, notice a change in weather, and do so without sacrificing their own rest because the second sleep was still waiting in the dark hours before dawn. Modern life has removed the fire and the shared sleeping space, but it has not removed the physiology. And when we restore the darkness and the permission, the physiology reasserts itself. The health implications are meaningful because the second sleep is where much late-night REM occurs, and REM in older age is closely tied to emotional resilience, memory consolidation, and even the brain's nightly clearance processes. When elders are pressured to stay in bed trying to force continuous sleep, or worse, are given sedatives that suppress REM, they lose the very phase that helps them wake feeling balanced. When they are allowed a natural biphasic night, with a calm middle, they often find that mood steadies, that morning stiffness eases because the first deep sleep was uninterrupted, and that daytime napping becomes less desperate because the night itself was more complete. The social dimension matters too. In many traditional societies, the middle interval was a time for quiet companionship between elders, for low conversation, for prayer or reflection, not for isolation and frustration. Recreating even a small version of that today, a shared cup of warm tea in dim light with a partner who is also awake, a brief journal entry by amber light, a few slow breaths together, can transform the middle from a lonely gap into a meaningful pause. It is not about romanticizing the past, it is about aligning expectations with biology. You do not need to sleep like a 20-year-old to be well rested at 70. You need to sleep like a 70-year-old in conditions that honor the pattern your body remembers, which is a pattern shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of long nights. Keep evenings dark early. Avoid stimulating screens after sunset. Keep the bedroom cool. And when you wake in the middle, do not reach for the clock, reach for calm. Let the second sleep come as a natural descent rather than a forced recapture. And trust that waking briefly does not mean you have failed at sleep. It means your body is following an older, wiser map through the night, a map that once kept whole communities safe and that still knows how to bring you gently to morning. The final gift of allowing a biphasic night in later life is not just better sleep, it is a different relationship with time itself. Because when you stop measuring the night by a single block and start experiencing it as a landscape with a valley in the middle, the pressure that drives so much late life insomnia begins to dissolve. Many elders lie awake not because their bodies cannot sleep, but because they are afraid of waking, afraid that a middle arousal means decline, disease, or loss of control. That fear triggers the very arousal that prevents the second sleep, creating a loop that medication often cannot break. When you replace the fear with knowledge, when you understand that surfacing around 2 or 3 is a normal expression of an aging circadian system, the loop weakens. You go to bed earlier because you are sleepy. You enjoy a deep first sleep that still provides the slow waves needed for physical repair. You wake calmly, you stay in low light and warmth, and you trust that the second sleep will come, and most nights it does. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, human longevity depended not on sleeping like the young, but on sleeping in a way that fit each life stage, and for elders that way included a natural division of the night that allowed them to rest deeply and also to be lightly available to the group during the darkest hours. That availability was not a burden, it was a contribution, and the physiology that supported it is still present. When modern culture honors it again, elders often report something deeper than improved sleep scores. They report a sense of belonging to the night rather than being exiled from it. They stop dreading bedtime, they stop clock watching, they stop defining a good night as one without waking. Instead, they begin to notice the quiet beauty of the middle, the way the house sounds different at 2 Amenia, the way thoughts are slower and kinder, the way the second sleep carries them into dreams that feel more vivid because they were not cut short by an alarm. Practically, this means designing evenings for darkness, not stimulation, turning off overhead lights after dinner, using warm lamps, keeping the bedroom cool and truly dark. And if you wake, resisting the urge to turn on the day, keep a small amber light for safety, keep a blanket nearby, keep movements slow, and remind yourself that you are not broken. You are following a pattern your ancestors followed for hundreds of thousands of nights. Over months, this consistency retrains the nervous system. The first sleep deepens, the middle shortens and becomes peaceful, the second sleep lengthens, and daytime energy stabilizes without the crashes that come from forced consolidation or sedative hangover. Families benefit too, because when an elder is not anxious about sleep, the whole household sleeps more calmly. The narrative shifts from managing insomnia to honoring a natural rhythm, and that shift is powerful medicine in itself. You are not trying to turn back the clock to youth. You are allowing the clock to move forward into a stage where sleep naturally divides, and in that division there is not loss but completeness. A first descent for the body, a quiet watch for the spirit, and a second ascent for the mind, all held within a single long night, exactly as nights were held for the vast majority of human history before electric light convinced us that waking in the dark was a failure instead of a feature. In the modern world, we rarely notice how much our sleep is shaped by the length of darkness outside the window, but if you track your own nights across a year, you will feel it. Winter pulls you toward 2 sleeps and summer pushes you toward 1, not because your discipline changes, but because your biology is still listening to light. In December, when nights in many places stretch to 14 or 15 hours of true dark, the body has more time than it needs for a single block of unconsciousness, so it naturally divides. You fall early into a deep first sleep, you surface around 2 or 3 into a calm middle, and then you sink into a second dream-rich sleep that carries you to a late dawn. In June, when darkness may last only 6 or 7 hours, the same body compresses, the first sleep starts later, the middle disappears or shortens to a brief stirring, and the second sleep is truncated because light arrives early. This seasonal flexibility is not a flaw, it is the original design. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, humans lived without electric light, and their nights expanded and contracted with the seasons, and the sleep system evolved to be plastic, to split when nights were long and to consolidate when nights were short, always prioritizing the completion of deep sleep first and REM second, within whatever dark window was available. Industrial lighting broke that dialogue by creating a perpetual summer. Inside our homes, we keep bright white light on until 11, we wake to alarms before sunrise, and we expect the same 8-hour block in January and July. The result is a chronic mismatch in winter. The body wants a long, dark and a biphasic pattern, but we give it a short, bright evening and then blame ourselves for waking at 3. When you restore seasonal darkness, even partially the old pattern returns without effort. In winter, dim the house after sunset, use warm, low light, go to bed earlier. Allow the middle waking to be a quiet valley rather than a problem, and protect the second sleep in the morning by keeping blinds closed until you are truly ready to rise. You will notice the first sleep deepens, the middle feels peaceful, and the second sleep brings vivid dreams that leave you emotionally lighter. In summer, accept a naturally later bedtime and a more consolidated night. Do not force an early first sleep when light is still strong. Instead, use blackout curtains to protect the shorter dark window you do have, so the brain can still get both deep and REM sleep in a compressed form. The key insight is that biphasic sleep is not an all-or-nothing identity. It is a seasonal capacity. Your ancestors did not sleep the same way year-round. They slept in 2 phases in long winter nights when the group huddled for warmth and kept a soft watch, and they slept in one tighter phase in short summer nights when activity stretched late. Modern insomnia often peaks in winter precisely because we fight this natural expansion. We try to maintain a summer schedule in a winter body, and the body responds by waking in the middle and staying awake with anxiety. When you align your expectations with the season, giving yourself permission for a longer divided night in winter and a shorter, more consolidated night in summer, sleep stops feeling broken and starts feeling responsive. You are not failing at consistency. You are practicing the same flexibility that allowed humans to thrive across latitudes and climates for hundreds of thousands of years, a flexibility that remembers that darkness is not just an absence of light, It is the signal that tells the brain how to shape the night, sometimes in one movement, sometimes in two, always in service of waking whole. In the modern world, we treat every night as if it were the same length, but for the vast majority of human history, nights change dramatically with the seasons, and the biphasic pattern breathed with that change, expanding in winter and contracting in summer, which is why trying to sleep the same way in July as in January often feels like a struggle against something you cannot name. When darkness lasts 14 hours in deep winter, the body does not try to fill all of it with one continuous unconsciousness. It naturally divides, offering a long first sleep for deep physical repair, a spacious middle interval for quiet wakefulness, and then a second sleep that stretches toward a late dawn rich with dreaming. In summer, when darkness may last only 6 or 7 hours, the same physiology compresses, the middle shortens or disappears. The two sleeps press closer together and can feel like a single block, not because the pattern is gone, but because there is simply less night to hold it. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, humans lived without electric light to flatten the seasons, so their sleep architecture followed the sky, deeper and more divided in winter, lighter and more consolidated in summer. And this seasonal flexibility was not a disorder, it was adaptive. Winter's long nights gave time for immune restoration, for storytelling in the middle, for emotional processing in extended REM, while summer's short nights allowed more waking activity for hunting, gathering, and social life. Industrial lighting erased that rhythm by giving us a perpetual summer evening indoors, bright enough to suppress melatonin year-round, and then we invented the expectation of a fixed 8-hour block every night regardless of season. The result is a chronic mismatch. In winter, we do not get enough darkness to allow the full biphasic expansion, so we feel tired despite sleeping. And in summer, we try to force a long block into a short biological night, so we lie awake frustrated. Reclaiming the seasonal aspect does not require moving to a cabin. It requires allowing your nights to be longer in winter, and accepting that you may naturally wake in the middle, and allowing your nights to be shorter in summer without guilt. In practice, this means dimming lights much earlier from October to March, creating a true long dark window of 10 or more hours, protecting the middle as a calm valley rather than a problem, and letting the second sleep complete itself toward a later sunrise. In summer, it means not forcing yourself into bed at 9 when light is still strong, but instead keeping evenings dim, accepting a later first sleep, and trusting that a shorter, more consolidated night is appropriate for the season. When you live this way, the anxiety around middle wakings in winter fades because you expect them. You prepare for them with warmth and low light. You use them for quiet reflection, and you return to a deep second sleep that leaves you truly restored. In summer, you stop fighting the natural lightness of sleep and stop labeling it insomnia. The body remembers this seasonal dance because it evolved within it. The same brain that knows how to divide a long night also knows how to compress a short one, but it cannot do either well under constant bright evenings. Giving the seasons back to your sleep is therefore not a luxury. It is a restoration of context, a way of letting your physiology express the full range it was designed for, over hundreds of thousands of years of changing light. When you honor winter's invitation to sleep in 2 parts and summer's invitation to sleep more lightly, nights stop feeling broken and start feeling appropriate, and you rediscover what our ancestors knew without needing to name it, that sleep is not a fixed industrial product, but a living rhythm that expands and contracts with the dark, always returning in winter to its oldest shape. A first sleep, a quiet middle, and a second sleep carrying you gently to dawn. If you have followed the long arc from prehistory to the present, the final question is not whether biphasic sleep existed, but what to do with that knowledge now, in a world of electric light, early alarms, and short winter days spent indoors. The answer is not to romanticize the past or to quit modern life, but to reclaim the conditions that allow the old pattern to express itself when your body asks for it. Because the pattern never disappeared, it was only masked. Your brain still builds sleep pressure in 2 waves across a long night. Your temperature still dips twice. Your REM still clusters toward dawn. And when you give the night enough darkness, the division reappears without training. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, Humans moved through nights that were long, cool, and dark, and their sleep naturally organized into a first deep sleep for the body, a calm middle for quiet wakefulness, and a second dream-rich sleep for the mind. That architecture is still encoded in you, and it surfaces most easily in winter, during illness, on weekends, on retreats, or whenever you remove the bright evening light that compresses the night. Reclaiming it starts with permission. Permission to go to bed earlier when you are sleepy, permission to wake in the middle without panic, permission to stay in dim warmth instead of reaching for a phone, and permission to let a second sleep arrive on its own. Practically, this means dimming the house after sunset, using amber or candle-like light, keeping screens out of the bedroom, cooling the room, and protecting a dark window of 9 to 10 hours in winter. It means treating a middle waking as a valley, not a failure. Breathing slowly, staying horizontal, maybe journaling a few lines by low light, and then returning to sleep without checking the clock. Over weeks, the nervous system learns that the middle is safe, and the second sleep deepens. The benefits are not mystical. They are measurable in how you feel. Mornings become less jarring because you are not ripped from deep sleep by an alarm. Dreams become more recallable because REM was allowed to finish. Daytime irritability softens because emotional processing completed overnight. And the dread of bedtime fades because the night is no longer a performance to perfect. This is not about sleeping like a pre-industrial farmer every night. It is about having access to the full repertoire your biology offers, so that on nights when the pattern emerges, you cooperate with it instead of fighting it. Modern life will still require consolidated sleep sometimes, for work, for travel, for summer's short nights, and the body can do that too, but the flexibility to shift between 1 and 2 phases is the real health. The cultural shift is the hardest part, because we have been taught to call any waking insomnia. Reframing it as the natural middle watch, a time our ancestors used for reflection, connection, and quiet, changes the physiology itself, lowering arousal and allowing the second sleep to return. You do not need a new supplement or device. You need darkness, warmth, and a story about the night that matches your biology. When you provide those 3 things consistently, even in a city apartment, the ancient pattern reasserts itself. Not every night, but often enough to remind you that sleep is not broken, it is whole, and wholeness has always included a first descent, a peaceful plain, and a second ascent toward morning, a journey shaped over hundreds of thousands of nights, and still available tonight if you let the dark be long enough to hold it. If you want to live the old pattern in a modern apartment, you do not need to abandon your life. You need to redesign the edges of your night so that darkness can do its work again, because the biphasic rhythm is not lost. It is only waiting for the right cues. Start with light, the single most powerful signal. 2 hours before you intend your first sleep, dim everything. Turn off overheads. Use warm amber lamps or candles. Put phones on night mode and face down, because melatonin cannot rise under bright white light, and without melatonin the first sleep will be shallow and late. Keep the bedroom cool, around 17 to 19 degrees, and truly dark, blackout curtains, no LED dots, no hallway spill, because the middle waking stays calm only when the brain still believes it is night. Go to bed earlier than habit suggests, not at 11 when the day is done, but at 9:30 or 10, allowing the long dark window that makes a division possible. The first sleep will come quickly and feel heavy. You will likely surface naturally between 1 and 3, and this is the moment most people ruin by turning on the day. Do not check the clock. Do not check messages. Keep light low and warm. Stay in bed if you're drowsy, or move quietly to a chair with a blanket. Sip water. Breathe slowly. Read a few pages of paper by amber light. Let thoughts drift without solving them. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, this middle interval was not a problem to fix but a valley to inhabit, a time for quiet reflection, for tending a low fire, for listening to the house settle, and your nervous system still recognizes that state when you give it darkness and warmth instead of stimulation. After 20 to 60 minutes, sleepiness returns on its own, not forced, and the second sleep begins, lighter, dream-rich, carrying you toward morning. Protect that second sleep fiercely. This is where emotional integration happens, so keep alarms late enough to allow it. Keep the room dark until you are ready to rise, And avoid caffeine after midday so pressure builds properly for the first sleep the next night. During the day, anchor the rhythm with morning light. Step outside within 30 minutes of waking, even on cloudy days, because strong light in the morning tells the brain when night truly ended and makes the next first sleep deeper. In winter, expand the dark window to 10 or 11 hours. In summer, allow it to contract naturally. Do not force the same schedule year-round. If you share a bed, agree on low-light rules for the middle. Use eye masks and separate blankets if needed, so one person's calm waking does not become the other's alarm. Over weeks, the pattern stabilizes. The first sleep deepens. The middle becomes peaceful rather than anxious. The second sleep lengthens. And mornings feel less jarring because you woke from REM instead of being ripped from deep sleep. You are not inventing a new biohack. You are removing the interference that industrial light and constant schedules placed over a system that evolved over hundreds of thousands of long nights. The goal is not to wake every night at 2. The goal is to give your body permission to divide the night when it needs to, and to trust that division as restorative rather than broken. When that permission is consistent, sleep stops being a performance you monitor and becomes a landscape you move through, with a first descent, a quiet plane, and a second rise toward light, exactly the shape that allowed human beings to rest deeply and stay lightly vigilant through the long nights that shaped us from the beginning. This is the end of the 12 axes, and the simplest truth to carry forward is this: you were never designed to sleep in one perfect block every night of your life. You were designed to sleep in a rhythm that adapts to darkness, to season, to age, and to community. And that rhythm most often expresses itself as 2 sleeps with a quiet middle when nights are long enough to hold them. For more than 200,000 years, since the origin of our species, human beings fell into a deep first sleep soon after dusk, surfaced in the middle of the night into a calm interval of low light and low arousal, and then sank into a second dream-rich sleep that carried them to dawn. And this was not folklore, it was physiology shaped by long nights without electric light. We did not lose that physiology when we invented the light bulb. We only covered it with bright evenings, fixed schedules, and the belief that any waking is insomnia. When you remove even part of that covering, by dimming the house after sunset, by going to bed earlier in winter, by keeping the middle dark and warm, by protecting the second sleep in the morning, the old pattern returns not as a disorder but as a relief. The first sleep restores the body, the middle gives the mind a place to settle without pressure, and the second sleep integrates emotion and memory through REM, and together they leave you waking whole rather than fragmented. This is true for infants who need contact in the middle, for children who learn that waking is safe, for adults who rediscover creativity in the quiet hour, and for elders whose bodies naturally return to the 2-part shape. It is true in winter when nights expand and in summer when they contract. The practice is not complicated. It is permission. Permission to let the night be long. Permission to stay in dimness when you surface. Permission to trust that sleep will come again without effort. You do not need to live in a pre-industrial village to experience this. You need only to honor darkness as a nutrient, to treat the middle as a valley rather than a failure, and to measure a good night not by uninterrupted hours but by how restored you feel at dawn. When enough people remember this, the cultural story shifts, from fixing sleep to allowing sleep, from fearing the dark to inhabiting it, and the anxiety that drives so much modern insomnia begins to soften. The 12 axes have traced that story from biology to history to daily life, and they all point to the same quiet conclusion. Your body remembers the long nights that shaped us. It still knows how to descend, to pause, and to rise again, and tonight, if you give it darkness and time, it will show you the shape it has always known, a first sleep, a peaceful middle, and a second sleep carrying you gently home to morning.